Okay, I think this is working. So we're about to start the ergogenic aid lecture for UCSU Stanislaus nutrition students. By far one of the more, I think, exciting topics in the field of nutrition and sports nutrition. Lots to cover in this lecture. I think it's a good sort of starting point. This is a huge field, and you walk into your local GNC or even grocery store nowadays, and you'll see hundreds and hundreds of different potential ergogenic aids, or at least products claiming to be ergogenic aids, on the shelf. So we're going to kind of dive into some of them. Specifically, start off talking more big picture issues and categories within the ergogenic aid field. Lots of exciting areas to go into research for those of you going on to graduate school or even while you're a student at CSU Stanislaus. It's a kind of a nice area to really just take a product, give it to an athlete or an individual and see how their performance is with and without that product. So starting off at the very least, let's get to the definition. An ergogenic aid, this is very textbook, but basically means tending to increase work. So work enhancing substances or phenomena believed to increase performance. Another definition, substance believed to remove the subjective constraints that may limit physiologic capacity. So pretty much anything you can do to yourself or even other things that can improve your performance. So that's, enhancing your ability to perform in some way. A question then to ask yourself, what types of sports and events would you see ergogenic aids, being useful, and the pretty much the answer that we usually come to when we discuss this in class is pretty much everything, right? Any form of competition could benefit from an ergogenic aid just because they help you succeed. So everything from the most competitive power sports and highest level of any sport, even to activities such as, playing chess. And, chess, whether you consider it a sport or not, is actually subject to different types of regulations that prohibit the use of certain ergogenic aids. Another sort of follow-up question then, when we start talking about ergogenic aids, what would be the optimum ergogenic aid? Is there a perfect one that's out there? And, I have these pictures of Popeye up, and, in the context of the Popeye cartoon, which I'm sure predates all of you in this class. It actually even predates me, but they used to show it on TV a lot when I was a kid. Popeye took spinach, right? And what did spinach do for Popeye? Oh man, it turned him into a beast in every aspect of the word. Whatever he needed to do after taking spinach, he could do it. And then what happened? Well, the effects kind of disappeared. Defining perfect in terms of ergogenic aid is an interesting exercise. What would that look like in the real world, not the Popeye cartoon world, right? I usually follow the logic of, firstly, is it safe? It's not, to me, it's not worth taking something that's going to damage your health or put your health in jeopardy in any way. So perfect ergogenic aid has to be safe. Obviously, it has to be effective in helping you improve your performance to some level. Hard to define exactly what that level is. 1% improvement, or does it need to be 10%, 50%? It needs to be affordable or at least easily accessible. It can't be something that is impossible to get. Otherwise, it's really not that perfect. So the question, and there is no right answer, but it is something to think about. Is there a perfect ergogenic aid out there? Lots of people are using them. All right, so when we talk about ergogenic aids, and this is obviously a nutrition class, so we'll focus more on nutritional ergogenic aids as we move forward in this discussion. But generally, there's 5 categories. Some researchers, authors, teachers will use less categories. Some will use more, but I like to use these 5 because they're kind of different enough from each other to sort of distinguish the categories. There's nutritional, and the nutritional ones, are obvious, I think, right? At least in this class. We're talking about protein supplements, botanical extracts, which you'll see in a lot of supplements, would be considered nutritional. Sports drinks, so using, carbohydrates, which are what most sports drinks are made out of, although they're getting creative with them now as well. You're going straight nutrition: carbs, proteins, fats. How can you use those macronutrients? How can you use vitamins and minerals that are found in foods to enhance performance? The pharmacological is probably the next biggest and probably most prominent category. And there's sometimes a lot of mixing of the nutritional ergogenic aids with pharmacological agents. I'm not going to get into that so much today, but so pharmacological ergogenic aids are basically made in the laboratory. We're talking, just like drugs or other medicines, where they're made in test tube usually, or some other sort of lab setting. Things like caffeine, steroids, hormones, amphetamines, we're talking stimulants, that kind of stuff. Those will be considered pharmacological. On the right side of the screen, we have physiological, and there aren't too many physiological ergogenics. Blood doping is one we'll talk about today. We'll get into the details of that in a bit, but that is changing your physiology to make you a better athlete. And it's not changing it through the use of a nutritional or a pharmacological agent, but actually physically changing your physiology somehow. Some people might argue the Tommy John surgery, which baseball pitchers often undergo to repair their pitching arm. The result of that is often a higher velocity of their pitch. That could be argued to be a physiological ergogenic aid, right? They've changed their physiology, or actually their anatomy a little bit in this case, to create a better product. They're at a faster pitch in this case. So psychological ergogenic, definitely mental imagery, and you'll see in a lot of sports, diving and other sports where there's more of a performance aspect or a sequencing kind of activity going on. Psychological preparation and imaging is massively important for success, and psychological techniques then to enhance that practice can be considered an ergogenic, just like even getting just a handle on the psychology of your approach to playing and competing can serve as an ergogenic aid. Finally, there's mechanical ergogenic aids, and this obviously comes down to sports that use some type of equipment. Cycling is an easy one to pick on. You can look at the evolution of the bike. The road bikes aren't quite as dramatic in terms of their changes, but they've gotten a heck of a lot lighter, a little bit more aerodynamic over the decades. Mountain bikes have changed incredibly over the last couple decades that they've been around. So as the equipment gets better, the athletes are then able to perform better. All right, who uses ergogenic aids? This should be probably an easy answer, at least in the context of competition. You can probably find ergogenic aids at every level, whether it's the weekend warrior or the top athletes. Someone out there is trying something, and depending on how you define ergogenic aids makes it a little easier to make that statement with confidence. It can be argued, which I will in a minute, that drinking water is an ergogenic aid. If you go run a marathon and don't drink water, that puts you at a huge disadvantage. So water will help you perform. Does it give you an advantage over other athletes? Probably not, unless they decide not to drink. So at the very least, who is using them? Yes, athletes of all types. We see them in the high school and the college atmosphere or environment for sure. At the local clubs and gyms, yes, for sure. And then we kind of have accidental users of ergogenics, and we see ergogenic aids pop up in a lot of diet medications, dietary supplements, as well as clinical populations. People undergoing treatments for certain conditions will be taking something like a hormone or like, hormones, either like erythropoietin, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that increases red blood cell mass, or even hormones to help with anabolism, right, to keep muscle mass or whatever that is. So they're all over the place. Ergogenic aids kind of fall into two categories. The ones that are relatively benign and everyone uses, I'll use water as an example, right? Yeah, everybody uses water. I'll say it's an ergogenic aid because it is something that can improve performance if it's not used, in comparison. But then the other side of the ergogenic aid world is this abuse, right? This doping and the illegal substances, the banned substances, basically the cheaters, right? And so there is that world of, hey, is there a product I can take that will enable me to beat the competition, but somewhat unfairly, or at least based on the guidelines that some organization has put forward. So the term doping, use of a substance in an excess amount for the specific purpose of improving performance, that's pretty vague and pretty, non-specific, right? Like the bullet below, it says, yes, any substance can be abused, even water, right? I'm using water as my example today. Can you drink too much water to the point of causing harm? Absolutely. People die every year, unfortunately, from water intoxication. But in the world of athletics, and just this past week, and this right now is November 2015, just this past week, a massive report from the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, W-A-D-A, came out against the Russian Athletic Federation, and the report basically uncovered widespread abuse of ergogenic aids, hormones, stimulants, and the whole basically gamut of products to help Russian athletes succeed at the last Olympics. Massive issue, right? It's a big deal. Hard to control, hard to get a handle on. There is, or I hope there still is, a class at CSU Stanislaus, the drugs in the athletic environment. It's a class I taught way back in 2003, 4, and 5, I think, and maybe 2006. One of my favorite classes. It really digs deep into these issues related to drug use and regulations and the physiological effects of all these different drugs. Not getting that deep into it today, of course. It's a whole class on that. So if you have the opportunity to take it, if it still exists, I highly recommend it. Going a little further into these issues with ergogenic aids, the World Anti-Doping Agency is sort of obviously the agency that sort of governs the world, but each country and then even each sport organization within a country has its own regulations and checks, and they have often their own unique set of banned and controlled substances. Banned substances are those that can't be found in the athlete in any amount, trace amount of this substance. And there's a brief list there, stimulants, anabolics, narcotics, diuretics. There's a whole bunch of drugs then within each of those sort of categories that is a specific drug. If an athlete is found using a banned substance, there's an immediate consequence. Controlled substances are a little bit different. Caffeine used to be on the controlled substance list. It's not anymore, but controlled substances are those that an athlete can have a certain amount in their body, but there's a threshold. And if they have too much of it in their blood or whatever they're testing, their urine, then they've exceeded the tolerable limit or whatever, and there's going to be consequences to them. Caffeine used to be on that list, and so it used to be, you could drink a couple cups of coffee before a race and you'd be fine, but basically if you had somewhere to the equivalent of 12 to 14 cups of coffee, like within an hour before the drug test, you would test positive for abusing caffeine. You would be beyond that threshold. Multiple reasons for why caffeine is not controlled anymore. One of them is it isn't considered harmful the way they thought it was initially. And secondly, their threshold previously was really hard to get past. I mean, that's a lot of coffee, but people would take it through other means as well. So one of the bottom lines is, and for those of you college athletes in the class or athletes in other sports, outside of the college atmosphere, drug testing is a reality, and ultimately it is up to the athlete to know, what's expected of them. It's up to them to know if something is banned and what's in a particular supplement. I'm not going to get too deep into the supplement world today because it is fascinating and sometimes mind-boggling. But reports from Consumer Reports, and this is probably going on to a decade now, but it's the last one I've come across. I'm sure there's been more. But this whole athletes needing to know if something is banned or not. Well, if you go into your local GNC or whatever supplement store you like to go to, Consumer Reports basically did that and took random sample of, I forget the number, but tens if not hundreds of different supplements and tested them for what was in the product and basically compared what was in the product to what was claimed to be in the product. And the regulation of supplements in the US isn't overseen by the Food and Drug Administration like medicine is. And so supplement companies are able to claim whatever the heck they want about their products. They just have to say none of it's been approved by the FDA. And they're also basically able to put whatever they want in their product because nobody's really double checking. And because of that, when Consumer Reports did this piece, they basically said that over 50%, and I want to guess is over 60%, but now that the numbers are a little fuzzy, I'll say this: a significant portion, more than half of the supplements they tested had an additional substance in it that wasn't listed on the ingredients list and that was also banned. Meaning you have a protein supplement, for example, that says, hey, take this, on the label, mass gainer protein superfood, pictures of men and women with massive muscles on it. Well, people might want to take it because they think they're going to get bigger muscles. Taking a protein supplement by itself won't do that. But what this report sort of flushed out was that these companies were adding some anabolics. They're adding some hormones to the supplements, thereby giving the consumer who's taking it, gains, whatever, based on whatever product they put in there. If it's an anabolic steroid, they're going to get bigger muscles just because they're taking it. And so getting back to the issue of athletes needing to know what they're taking, it's really tricky, right? And people who get drug tested, especially college athletes, I've been, when I was at St. Mary's, I was involved with this for those 10 years. Unknowingly, athletes can consume a protein supplement that they think is great, and there's something, it was laced with something from the manufacturers, and they get busted. So anyway, it's a tricky world out there. You need to be careful. There are supplements out there that claim to be clean and NCAA approved, or a lot of them will go out of their way to say that everything is clean, but you do your homework, make sure, you get on the internet. It's an infinite resource, but you've got to be savvy with that, of course. But make sure that if you're that athlete who does get tested and needs to be careful, double check the products that you're taking. Continuing on with this sort of idea about, using ergogenic aids and, do athletes use it, whether or not they're banned. And this picture on this slide, I just pulled it off the internet, but I have to assume it's a Photoshop. Nobody is that big. There was an interesting study done back in the mid 90s, and almost 200 Olympic power athletes were surveyed confidentially, and basically they were offered this scenario. You're offered a banned substance with two guarantees: you will not be caught using it, and by taking the substance you're going to win. Only 3 of the 198 said they wouldn't take it. Again, this win at all cost attitude, ergogenic aids. If there's an ergogenic aid that will do that, athletes are likely to take it, right? It gives them that competitive advantage. If they're not going to get caught, then what's the penalty, right? And so there's an ethical, sort of a moral issue around that. The same athletes then were offered a second sort of scenario with 2 additional guarantees. One is that if they took the substance, they're going to win not just the upcoming event, but every event for the next 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, they will die. Only 50% still said they would take it, which is incredible to me. So this is, again, it's quite dated now. It's 20 years old. 20 years old now. But, I don't think the mentality has changed much in the world of competition and athletics. Crazy. All right, let's get back to ergogenic aids specifically. So talking about nutritional ergogenics, and it's an interesting world with nutritional ergogenics. It's an area where my research, I really love to play around with ergogenic aids to see if they've worked. I've done some work with glycerol and some work with sodium bicarbonate specifically. Some of the other buffers, some beta-alanine out there. I've done a little bit of creatine research. I love to do it because it's so easily manipulable, right? We can take an athlete, change different things about the ergogenic aid they take, and we can immediately sort of see results in some cases. Lots of fun. But the nutritional ergogenic aid research world is tricky in a sense, because most research, when it's done right, we need to ensure certain baseline values. And with nutrition, it's always smart to take an individual who has adequate nutritional status. And so a lot of research on nutritional ergogenic aids come back inconclusive, or there is no effect of this nutritional ergogenic aid. A lot of times it's because the athletes that they tested, or the individuals that they tested, already had such high quality nutritional status, right? They need to start off being in a good place. You can't take people who are malnourished and give them that ergogenic aid, because then everyone has to have the same level of malnourishment. And then it would be hard to compare. It wouldn't be comparing apples to apples necessarily. So so a lot of research, especially on proteins, it says, yeah, if you were consuming adequate protein from your diet, taking another, protein supplement isn't really going to do you much good. But a lot of us understand that in reality, that's not usually the case, and individuals aren't usually getting enough of certain nutrients in their diet. And so taking these supplements will at least help them get to that, optimal place when it comes to nutrition. There is a fair amount of good research done on individual amino acids that does prove and show advantages, ergogenic advantages, even in the presence of adequate nutritional status. Things like glutamine, creatine we'll talk about in a minute. So there are some nice examples that actually kind of buck the trend of good nutritional status equaling no effect on nutritional ergogenic aids or from them. Some examples of nutritional ergogenics, proteins and amino acids, they're everywhere. Proteins are considered, whole proteins, which is a complement of amino acids. Whey protein, whey isolate is probably the most popular out there. I'm seeing a lot more options out there in protein supplements. I'm seeing some beef. I'm seeing some vegetarian ones. So some, pea, rice, hemp, soy's been out there for a while. So lots of different sort of sources of protein. I always think it's a good idea to get a balance. So I try and avoid whey protein because I eat dairy. So it's like too much dairy, but whey protein is definitely a good quality protein supplement. Glycerol, I don't think we're going to talk about today, but is a hydrating agent that has been used to hyperhydrate individuals. Coffee has been used quite a bit. I'll talk about caffeine a little bit later. Carbohydrate loading. Oh yeah, that's been around for a long time, and lots of studies done on just sports drinks. Hey, if you drink a sports drink versus water during an endurance activity, which is better? It's a pretty much no-brainer in terms of the research world. Gatorade has become a multi-gazillion dollar company because of those types of comparisons, at least in the science world. It's like, yeah, of course Gatorade, something that's full of sugar and a couple of electrolytes, is going to help an athlete outperform themselves compared to when they just drink water. So lots of research out there on those ergogenics. Let's talk about some specifics. I'm going to kind of move through these quickly, not because they're not important, but because there's a lot of them. It is absolutely an incomplete list. My idea of what's hot and what's not in the ergogenic world, it's not probably the best indication of what's out there. It's always changing. Every year I kind of update this to, okay, what's going on right now? And like I said in the beginning of the talk, there's hundreds of them out there. I'm going to cover maybe 10. You do have an assignment coming up that is associated with this talk and with ergogenic aids. Obviously use some of them on this list, but also, get outside the box and do some research and find some other products that are out there. Like I said, this is not an exhaustive list in any way, but I'll talk about some of my favorites and some of the more popular ones at least. Creatine is still probably the golden child, so to speak, of ergogenic aids. Getting back to that original slide with Popeye, this is probably as close to a perfect ergogenic aid as we can get, I think. It's a naturally occurring non-essential amino acid. It's formed from glycine and arginine, so those two amino acids basically interact with each other with the help of an enzyme to form creatine. Most of creatine is stored in our muscles. A little bit's found in our blood. Our body can make it if we don't consume it, right? Because it's coming from non-essential amino acids. Vegans, so people who don't eat meat products, and that's basically where we find most of it in our diet, or actually all of it. We're eating the muscles of other animals. 90% of it's stored in our muscles, 95% of it is stored in their muscles as well. So people who consume meat, especially red meat, are getting probably about a gram a day of creatine. The rest our body synthesizes on its own. So vegetarians don't get the creatine in their diet. However, do they suffer because of it? Some interesting research out there. They definitely benefit more from taking a creatine supplement compared to meat eaters. And I'll repeat that. So vegetarians who take creatine will experience a greater improvement in a given activity, and then the research tests different types of things. Most of them are all related to power types of activities, but vegetarians will benefit more from creatine supplements than meat eaters, and most of it is because vegetarians pretty much exist with a lower level of creatine in their body, and so when they take the supplement, there's more room to grow, right? They're not as close to their ceiling or their full capacity of creatine storage. If you think of the muscles, they can only hold so much creatine. So when we take creatine as a supplement, it increases the concentration of creatine in the muscle. But if you're already eating, let's say, a gram or two a day worth of creatine from your meat consumption, that you're closer to that ceiling or that saturation level in your muscles, where vegetarians are starting from as close to baseline as they can get. So creatine is this essential substrate in the creatine phosphate reaction. So we talked about that way in the beginning of the term in the metabolism talk. But if you go to the phosphagen system, right, that creatine kinase reaction, which is that very first and the quickest reaction that gives us the ability to perform explosive, high energy activity, right, power moves and sprinting, that kind of stuff. We're working with adenosine diphosphate, so ADP, which is a byproduct of the breakdown of ATP, right? So the release of energy from ATP gives us a molecule of ADP. Well, the creatine kinase reaction, if you recall, all it's doing is taking that ADP and adding a phosphate back to make it ATP again. It's a really simple reaction. The ADP needs a molecule of creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is a creatine molecule with a phosphate added to it. That whole reaction, all it does is add that phosphate back to the ADP. Well, when we consume creatine as a supplement, it increases the free creatine in our muscle. When ATP gets split, right, when it releases its energy, when it's hydrolyzed, there's a free inorganic phosphate floating around. That phosphate will basically immediately bind with creatine to form creatine phosphate, and then we can combine that with ADP, and our cycle, right, this creatine kinase reaction can keep cranking out the ATP. So the higher the creatine concentration, the greater amount of creatine phosphate we can form at a high rate, and therefore the more ADP gets converted to ATP. Does it work? Well, research is pretty good on creatine. I haven't come across too many, especially recently, that really show any negative effects of it. Some of them are inconclusive, which happens quite a bit in this world, but creatine use, and I don't want to I'll get into details on creatine, but not too many on the other, not too much on the other ergogenics. It is a cyclical type of ergogenic aid. Most people say 6 to 8 weeks is enough, and you will saturate your muscles with it for about 6 to 8 weeks. At some point, your body starts to build up a tolerance for it, and these amino acids, this extra creatine that you're consuming, actually will get deaminated, right? So they'll get split, and we will then use those, potentially use the amino acids for other functions in our body, and the benefit then of supplementation starts to disappear, right? Your body starts to work back towards a place of homeostasis. Your muscle is at a certain baseline. Take the creatine, it really saturates the muscle, and after about that 6 to 8 weeks, whatever it is, your body starts to go, look, this is too much creatine in the muscle. Let's find out a way to actually drop it. So cycling creatine use is actually relatively important. There is some research saying that we may not need to do it, maybe not quite as dramatically, but I don't want to get into that too much. The dose, anywhere from 5 to 10 grams a day. A lot of manufacturers recommend a loading dose. That can be beneficial. If any of you decide to use it, just read the instructions. The proposed benefits include improved sprint performance and increased training volume and recovery. Those two things have absolutely been proven without a doubt. By improved sprint performance, are we faster? No. Are we able to sprint longer at a higher velocity? Yes. Are we able to repeat a sprint at the same velocity more effectively than if we hadn't taken creatine? Yes. So we're not faster, we're just able to do either more sprints in a short amount of time or extend the duration of a given sprint. And you can start to think, okay, in what context, what sports would this be beneficial? Being a soccer player, could creatine be beneficial for that? Absolutely. Basketball, I don't play it, but could it be beneficial? Absolutely. Lacrosse, yes. I mean, we're talking, go down the line. Baseball, yes. Some of the other claims, increased muscle mass and increased strength and power. I put the second there because those are secondary effects. Creatine allows an individual to do more work. We recover more quickly from high intensity efforts, and those efforts can be a little bit longer in duration. So it enables us to increase the volume of our training, and the byproduct of that is an increase in muscle mass, increase in strength and power. Just taking creatine and sitting on the couch will not lead to those two things. So that's important to understand. The side effects of creatine use are minimal. There is an issue with hydration. Creatine does increase water retention in the muscles. It brings a fair amount of water with it. So individuals who are taking creatine are going to be heavier right off the bat. That sometimes is a negative effect. So we have this picture of the sprinter here. He may have used creatine in his training, but before an event, it would be smart for him to be off creatine because he doesn't want to be carrying around an extra couple pounds of water in his muscles for that event. I think that might actually counterbalance or negate some of the benefits of using creatine in a short sprint. In terms of damaging effects, there was discussions about kidney issues and other stuff. Most of those have not been proven. So really very minimal, if any, side effects. Moving forward, HMB is another amino acid derived ergogenic aid. It's a metabolite of leucine, and leucine is one of the branch chain amino acids. So leucine, valine, and isoleucine are a branch chain. It is produced in small amounts, just like creatine. Our body can create HMB just like creatine in small amounts. Does taking more help? We'll talk about that in a second. The effect of HMB, it is a protein metabolism regulator. And so with increased amounts of HMB, we see less catabolism, which means less breakdown of muscle tissue and more building of muscle tissue. So just think of it as it plays a positive role in helping us maintain and gain muscle mass. There has been a fair amount of research done on it all the way back in 2003. There's even a meta-analysis done, so basically a summary of all the research that was out there on the use of HMB. Compared to placebo, about 25% improvement in strength. Most of the research showed the biggest benefit in untrained individuals. And that's sort of true across the board with ergogenic aids, right? The less trained you are, the more potential for benefit of anything, including just training without ergogenic aids. So the closer you are to being an elite athlete in fitness and performance, the less room there is for improvement. So it's, that's kind of usually an obvious thing to identify. But what we saw in these individuals who benefited, less muscle breakdown, and some minimal, at least a minimization of the wasting of muscles. Side effects, kind of like creatine, right? In the studies that were presented, there weren't any. This is not a regulated substance, so it's something just like creatine. Creatine is not regulated. It isn't something that can be tested for. It would take muscle biopsy. I don't even know how they would test for creatine. Same is true for HMB. So in terms of the World Anti-Doping Agency or the NCAA, which some of you might be familiar with, creatine is not smiled upon, but it is not something the NCAA can test for in any capacity. Next category, and this is getting into pharmaceuticals for the most part, are stimulants. Caffeine, amphetamines, things like cocaine. Sympathomimetics are a category of stimulants that are intended to mimic the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. So they increase heart rate, they increase metabolism, they increase blood pressure, they increase mental activity. There's a whole bunch of sort of drugs and herbal extracts that fall under that sympathomimetic category. Lots and lots of stimulants out there. Energy drinks, you got all these sort of, Monster and Red Bull, and all those drinks are throwing in stimulants. Obviously those of you that are coffee drinkers or some form of coffee, also a major stimulant is the caffeine in that. And they all kind of have a similar effect. How much are stimulants used? They're all over the place, right? So this slide is just basically looking at, what are the numbers that are out there? These numbers are getting dated, but they're still relevant. And I think they probably increase a little bit, especially on the caffeine side of things. Lots of individuals using stimulants. The interesting thing about stimulants is they're really not that effective as an ergogenic aid when it comes to physiological performance. When it comes to mental performance, they actually provide us a little bit of a good kick. So caffeine, if we want to pick on that, lots and lots of research done on caffeine. we've seen it improve endurance performance. So the delaying the time to fatigue or increasing the time to fatigue, however you want to put it. So various different exercising protocols, whether it's submaximal, so long duration activity, whether it's sort of sustained high activity, so high intensity, 20 to 60 minute protocols, or even sort of, a mile or even a 400 meter run type of distance, 1 to 5 minute type of activities. It seems to be beneficial for multiple types of events, both power and endurance. So if you want to get into sports, yes, the soccer, the basketball, the baseball, all that can potentially benefit from it. What's interesting is the benefit in strength and power overall is very minimum, right? People aren't faster when they take caffeine. They're not really stronger. There's some research out there that says, oh yeah, there's a 1 to 2% improvement. But what it does is it makes people a little bit more alert, a little bit more motivated, and that in of itself can create someone who can perform better. And so it's a little bit more of the neurological, right? That effect that enables caffeine to be more effective. On the endurance side of things, there is a mechanism in place that increases the availability of fatty acids for a fuel source. It takes a while to happen. About 3 hours is what most research says. So you take have a couple of double espresso before a long workout. 3 hours seems to be the peak time, but what happens is the caffeine, the effect of the caffeine makes more fat available as a fuel source. Metabolically speaking, we'll use more fat then, and because we're using more fat, we're using less caffeine, and because we're not less caffeine, less carbohydrates, and because we're using less carbohydrates, it enables us to perform for a longer duration before we run out of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are that fuel source that will limit endurance performance, and so there is that factor going on with caffeine that does sort of play specifically into the hands of endurance performance. Some random, and I should have cited all these studies, but some random effects on of caffeine on endurance performance. Massive improvements. Depends on what level you're competing at. If you're a weekend warrior who doesn't compete at all, the caffeine is maybe just part of your regular day, whatever. But if you are a competitive athlete, let's say you're a college cross country runner or something like that, could it provide a benefit, right? 4.2 seconds faster over a 1.5 kilometers, that's about a mile, or 1 to 3% faster, I guess, over 5K, which is maybe more of a cross country distance, could make a difference, right? If you're in the pack, that 1 to 3%, that might be just enough to win a race. So there's potentially motivation or a reason to explore the use of caffeine. How much is enough? Well, doses in the research world vary from about 2 to 9 milligrams per kg. If you're an average size individual, let's say you weigh 80 kgs, it's a little bit more than average, but if you weigh 80 kgs and you're looking at 2 milligrams per kilogram, that puts you at about 160 milligrams. That's a really strong cup of coffee, or maybe 2 cups of weak coffee. So 9 milligrams per kg, you were getting into 800 milligrams ish. That's a lot of caffeine. That would be 4 no-dose or 4 Vivarin. That's pushing the envelope, if you ask me. But we are, in the research world, where you see effects in that zone for sure. That the 2 to 5 milligrams tends to be pretty effective. What happens is with caffeine, for a lot of people, at least on the nervous system side, is that we build up a tolerance. The metabolic side, that free fatty acid thing, that stays. But what some of you might know who are listening to this is that the more coffee you drink over time, the more you need to kind of get that caffeine buzz. And so the need for some people to take 9 milligrams to get the psychological effects or the nervous system effects is necessary. So hopefully, if you're caffeine sensitive still, just a nice double espresso should get you going. Staying in the stimulant world, there's amphetamine stimulants, and these tend to be kind of on the threshold of prescription drugs or over-the-counter herbal supplements that should be prescription. Amphetamines, ephedrine, pseudoephedrine. We're talking some of those medications in cold medicine that are used to make crystal meth or ice or whatever you guys call it nowadays. So we're getting into this sort of gray area. Stimulants generally, other than caffeine for the most part, are banned. These herbal versions will create positive tests depending on the tests that are being used. These stimulants, these sympathomimetics, they will increase the metabolism of fatty acids, so they'll increase fat metabolism. They'll also increase the metabolism of carbohydrates. So what they do is they create heat. Your muscles basically turn on and they start to burn fuel. And that's why a lot of these were and are still used in diet aids, right? Hey, if I can take something that just burns fat and burns carbohydrates, I'm basically turning myself into a heat factory, right? Burning the calories while I'm just sitting around. The ergogenic effect of them is questionable at best. Are they as good as caffeine? There's been some research done. There's very little, and as you can imagine, because these things pose a health risk if you take too much, getting clearance to do tests on athletes by using them is very hard to do. But there have been a few studies done, and the effects in terms of improvement in strength and improvement in endurance have been minimal, right? Improvement in strength by 4% in this one study here, and endurance by 1.5%. And the dose they used was quite high. And some of the side effects of taking these, which don't really exist with caffeine, which is quite nice, right? Some people are really sensitive to caffeine and can, get the palpitations in their heart and have some side effects, but not to the extent that these amphetamines do. And so the side effects are quite dramatic, and there have been instances of cardiac arrest and other sort of long-term serious, even death type of effects. And kind of like caffeine is clearly addictive. Amphetamines are addictive as well, and they're a little bit more powerful. You'll see, especially at your supplement stores, a lot of combos because it's been recognized that the dose of these sympathomimetics is, when it gets to be high, can be quite dangerous. There's an attempt by manufacturers to combine the sympathomimetics with other stimulants that don't use the same mechanism of action. So we'll see things like guarana and other herbal versions, like the Ma Huang is an herbal version of ephedra, to start to be mixed. And so we get these combos. I have these pictures, these gifs of Rip Fuel and Metabolite. These are some common products that use this combining or stacking sort of approach. The effects and side effects are still the same. It hasn't really alleviated any of the issues with taking stimulants. All right, let's move forward to a new category, which is blood doping. I'm going to talk about two forms. Blood doping is pretty fascinating. There's two forms. There's sort of, and I'm using my air quotes right now, the natural version, and then there's sort of the pharmaceutical version, right? Using a basically synthetic or a produced hormone. Blood doping sort of is the process of increasing the number of red blood cells we have in our body. The purpose of increasing red blood cells, for those of you playing along with your physiology classes, is that red blood cells are incredibly important in delivering oxygen to our tissues, also incredibly important in carrying carbon dioxide away from our tissues. And so if we can find a way for our body to increase the amount of red blood cells we have as an endurance athlete especially, but it has crossover to other sports, mixed sports especially, right? Any activity where you do need to rely on high intensity activity, so you need to get oxygen to the tissues at the highest rate possible, but then also need to recover in between, having extra red blood cells is a massive, massive advantage. So obviously, you hear about blood doping quite a bit in endurance sports, cycling. You can, go read any of the reports on Lance Armstrong over the last decade and get the full report on what blood doping can do for an individual. But endurance sports, cycling, cross country skiing, those types of events is probably most prominent, or at least most talked about. So the two different forms, the first is the administration of blood, red blood cells, or related blood products, and we'll talk about the specifics of that. The second is the use of erythropoietin, or EPO, and that's a hormone that can be taken that will then stimulate our bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. Let's talk about EPO first. So EPO is naturally produced by our kidneys. It is the hormone that our kidneys release in situations where more red blood cells need to be produced, which is constantly, right? But it's been, used and originally used in clinical situations for people with leukemia and other conditions where they had a low red blood cell count and needed to have them increased. When more red blood cells are created, that increases the concentration of hemoglobin in our blood, and therefore hemoglobin, which is that oxygen carrier, enables us to get more oxygen to those tissues. Is it effective? Oh my gosh, yes. Even for some of you who have spent a significant time at a higher altitude, that will increase your red blood cell mass a little bit. Not to the extent that taking EPO will. EPO will far exceed that. But for those of you that have spent time at altitude and then come back down to sea level and you feel like you're superhuman for a little while, take that and multiply it by 10. So EPO use is quite simple. You just inject it and it does its thing. Dosing is kind of hard to keep track of, and there are protocols out there for those who use it to keep it in safe levels. If it's abused, it can be quite dangerous. And Surfer Joe's brother here, right, is asking us a question. Is it dangerous to supplement? It is a natural product. Well, of course it is. And abusing it can result in the overproduction of red blood cells, causing our blood to become really thick, right? Hematocrit is that value that describes the ratio of red blood cells to plasma in our blood. And when that ratio exceeds, 55%, our blood starts to get a little bit thick, kind of like mud. And that puts a lot of stress on the heart, and that could lead to a lot of cardiovascular issues. And so abusing EPO and not controlling it can be quite dangerous. So blood doping, and I want to warn some of you now, I don't know why, I know why I have to do this. I'm going to talk about blood for the next few minutes. I did have a student in a class at St. Mary's last year who I was speaking on this slide specifically, and the student passed out, had sort of what was called a vasovagal response, which I've never had anyone do that from just talking, but they were, I guess, visualizing the discussion about red blood cells, and they're one of those people who's very squeamish around blood and literally passed out in the middle of class. But I'm going to talk about blood for this next slide. If you're not cool about talking about blood, then you can just skip past it, or just mute me and then just, go to the next slide. But blood doping is a pretty interesting process. It's been around for a good 60, 70 years at least now. And the process is basically this. Within 2 to 3 months prior to a competition, an athlete will have a couple pints of blood removed from their body. From that blood, the red blood cells will be separated and frozen. This is a process that you cannot do in your home freezer. It needs to be done probably in a hospital. The athlete who had the blood removed will continue to train. During that training process, their body will reproduce the red blood cells, and it does take a couple months to get back to pre-blood donation or blood freezing levels, but then they get back to their homeostatic baseline point. And then about a week prior to competition, those frozen blood cells are put back into the body. All of a sudden, this athlete will benefit from a massive increase in the amount of red blood cells that they have in their blood. Most of us have in the neighborhood of 5 liters of blood in our body. We're talking 2 pints. We're putting at least 10 to 20% extra red blood cells back into our bloodstream. The alternative way to do this, which was also practiced quite a bit, was to have somebody else have 2 pints of their blood removed and red blood cells frozen. And then a week before competition, the athlete would have that other person's blood put into their body. The reason for this technique was to avoid the detraining that occurs, because if anyone gives 2 pints of blood, it's going to take you at least 2 or 3 weeks just to be able to get back to the same intensity of training that you were doing before that. It will wipe you out. And so that loss of training volume, right, there's going to be a fair amount of detraining. These high-level athletes can't afford that. And so there's a benefit to having someone else's blood be used for doping. Both techniques, as you can imagine, are quite dangerous, especially using someone else's blood. There's rejection issues if you didn't do the right technique, or if they have the wrong blood type. There's all these complications that can occur. So both of these, you're dealing with needles and all these sort of medical procedures, highly dangerous, and you need medical professionals to help with the process. the result is amazing, and the research out there, it's very limited, and there hasn't been any done for quite a while, I don't think. It's the results are amazing, right? It turns individuals into super athletes. This process, as well as using EPO, are clearly and obviously should be are banned, and so anyone caught doing them will be suffering the consequences. All right, next topic would be anabolic steroids. There are multiple versions and types out there. Most of them are trying to mimic the action of testosterone. There are those that mimic and are actually mimicking the human growth hormone. But both of those anabolic steroids are the ones that will lead to, hopefully, at least the athletes are hoping, increased power, increased muscle mass, and with human growth hormone, decreased fat mass. Lots of different ways to take them, lots of different ways to get them. 20, 30 years ago, it was really hard to get your hands on these types of products for the general athlete. You'd have to have a medical connection, kind of like with the blood doping. But with the wonderful invention of the internet and access to basically global pharmaceutical companies, getting testosterone shipped to your house in some way is quite simple. So there, use of steroids is banned universally. Different ways to get a hold of them. There's the oral use. The oral use of these hormones is questionable at best in terms of their effectiveness because of the digestion process. Some of the hormones are affected by digestive enzymes and the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So really the injection and the use of gels and creams has become sort of preferable in terms of effectiveness. Injection puts it straight into the muscle, and then for systemic circulation, it'll get distributed throughout the body. Gels and creams are sort of the similar effect, just a little bit slower acting in terms of getting it into your body. But those of you who are fans of Barry Bonds, one of the Bay Area favorites, was using the gels and the creams thinking it was vitamin B12 or whatever he said for so long. But it was a quite effective way to deliver those steroids. So the benefits, right? When we use these steroids in high doses, right? And there's sort of replacement dose, which is hormone replacement therapy. They have it for women. They have it for men as well. With men, it does tend to focus more on the testosterone and growth hormone. Women, it's a little bit more of the estrogen, some of the female hormones. Used as a replacement dose, these effects aren't seen. But when we start to abuse it and use it sort of in a mega dosing type of way, we do see things like increases in muscle mass, decrease in fat mass, depending if you're taking the human growth hormone, increased body weight. You're seeing muscles just getting bigger, you're getting stronger. There's a change in libido. It's not always increased. Sometimes it's decreased. A side effect can take, that can take you either direction. And so, those are the desired outcomes. What are some of the side effects? There's a lot of them. And this obviously comes back to the abuse factor. Can it affect us? Yes, it can affect our liver. It can affect our cardiovascular disease. It can affect our psychology. So all three of those bullets can be, minor or quite catastrophic in their level. It depends on the individual. Some people are very sensitive to taking it, and it depends on the dose. And so really it's hard to say who's going to respond and how. It's really a tricky world when it comes to using steroids. Other side effects, and there are gender-specific side effects. On the men's side, it can lead to a lot of feminine types of side effects. There are things like acne, premature baldness. And then we, moving down on the list, testicular atrophy, and then the gynecomastia, which is the man boobs, as Kramer's showing George Costanza's father on the graphic there. So some of the side effects for the men include those. There's others for the women. Then there's some masculinizing types of effects, right? And so we do see often male pattern baldness. The hirsutism, which is the development of facial hair, a deepening of voice. You'll often hear the term jowls, right? So there's a development of the jaw that is sometimes quite pronounced and obvious when in people who abuse steroids. So lots of different potential issues with abusing the anabolics. the world of hormones has also sort of obviously grown into what's called the prohormone supplements, and these are sort of precursors, right? So, hey, if we can't take actual testosterone, what if I take something that increases my circulating levels of testosterone and increases my body's natural production of them? There's androstenedione and the other two, which are a mouthful to pronounce, but they're basically all these products that will stimulate and result in an increased circulating hormone level, right? And the testosterone specifically. Androstenedione, or what used to be called andro, is one of the more researched ones out there. There's others, and there's others that are more effective than some of these that I'm going to talk about. There's always new ones coming up. Back in the day, another Bay Area baseball favorite, Mark McGwire, used andro, and right, he was accused of using steroids, and he kept saying, "No, I'm just using this product called andro. It's a natural product. I don't know why I'm getting so massive and hitting thousands of home runs." And so andro is something found in the pollen of a Scotch pine tree. So it is very, it's like, hey, how can it be bad for you? And its claims, the product claims are listed at the bottom there, right? Naturally boost testosterone, increase strength, energy, muscle mass, all that good stuff. Research has been done on it, and is it effective? Yes and no. And unfortunately, with andro specifically, the research shows that, yeah, it's effective at producing the negative side effects of using testosterone, with not many of the positive effects. So people are using it. We're seeing the man boobs. They're getting the acne. They're getting all those types of issues, but they weren't getting stronger or bigger. And so, lots of issues with taking it as well. What is the right dosing? If an individual has really low testosterone, they should probably take more to get to a place where they're going to benefit from it. Somebody who has naturally high testosterone, is taking this going to put them over the top to see these negative side effects? So really hard to figure out without some medical supervision. Most people taking it will not seek that out. Or if they had medical supervision, they'd probably just take the testosterone anyway, or the testosterone by itself. So moving on, new category, buffering agents, one of my favorites. And so buffering agents are a category of ergogenics that will mitigate metabolic acidosis after, and I should have put there, also during strenuous exercise, right? So we're talking about, high intensity sprinting activities, whatever type of athletic or whatever endeavor it is that is going to be limited by the production of hydrogen ions, right? So it's limited through acidosis. Sprinting is the best example. Why can't we sprint forever? Because this acidosis, this metabolic acidosis, develops in the muscles. Those ions, those hydrogen ions, will denature the enzymes responsible for keeping metabolism going, and we slow down. So these buffering agents are taken specifically to buffer the acid, to allow that environment within the muscle to stay at a more stable pH, allowing for metabolism to continue for a little bit longer. And so there's a few different products out there. Bicarbonate, so sodium bicarbonate actually is more specific. Sodium citrate as well. Bicarbonate citrate you can't just buy. But sodium bicarbonate, which is Arm & Hammer baking soda, the pure stuff. Don't get the don't get the scented stuff or any. It has to be pure. Sodium citrate, beta alanine is a little bit more. It's a newer one in terms of being more readily available. It's been around for a while. So I'll talk a little bit about sodium bicarbonate, which is the NaHCO3. It's been researched quite a bit, and it has shown some promise in swimming, running, sprinting events. I did some research on a group of rowers at St. Mary's College, which was basically a 2-kilometer rowing event. Could taking sodium bicarbonate improve their performance? Any types of activities that are pretty short term, at least in nature, and really high intensity. Is it effective? What does a bicarbonate do, and is it worth checking out if you're an athlete who might benefit from it? Our body does produce bicarbonate minus the sodium as a natural buffer. It is one of the primary buffers that helps us tolerate high intensity exercise for a short duration. So taking bicarbonate does increase the amount of it in our blood, and therefore ultimately that gets the amount that gets to our muscles. So taking it is effective in increasing its availability to do its work. The consumption of it does not put the athlete at risk for any serious health issues, and therefore it isn't banned. But for those of you who've ever taken it, which I don't expect any of you have, but maybe, consuming the volumes needed to get an ergogenic effect can result in some nasty side effects. And I'm probably stealing my own thunder because I think in a couple slides I'll talk about it. But consuming a lot of sodium bicarbonate, if you think about it, it's pretty nasty stuff. It's very hyperosmotic, so it will pull water into your gut. It will give you some diarrhea. It will give you some bloating. It will give you some gas, and it might give you some vomiting. So, is it worth taking that before an event? Again, depending on the research, the numbers are up to 50+% of individuals taking it will suffer those side effects. And because of those side effects, things like beta-alanine and sodium citrate, which doesn't have the dramatic side effects that sodium bicarbonate has, those have been used as well. So the sodium bicarbonate, the dose, somewhere between 0.2 and 0.3 milligrams per kg. So, it's not a huge dose, right? So basically about 20 grams for the average sized person. That's, a good handful of tablespoons. It's not that much. You mix it with water and you drink it down. The side effects are so common, and that's one of the bummers. And there is some research out there that's come up with alternative ways to take it. Instead of mixing it with water, if we put it in pill form, is it better? A little bit. If we spread the dose out over a whole day instead of taking it in one shot, is it better? Absolutely. How long does the stuff stay in our blood? Does it stay in overnight? Some of the research is saying yes. So there are researchers out there getting creative in how to use bicarbonate for its benefits and avoiding the side effects. But the side effects tend to scare everybody off for good reason. And before I move on, yes, is it effective? Research shows yes. If you can tolerate the side effects or if you don't experience them, it can help increase tolerance to that change in acidosis, or at least it will help attenuate the change and therefore allow individuals to sprint longer. It's almost like creatine in that way. The rowers that I tested at St. Mary's were able to complete their 2-kilometer row in a faster time when they took the sodium bicarbonate, but I too had several subjects who experienced the gastrointestinal side effects. The other buffer I'll talk about sort of in some detail is beta-alanine, and this is sort of operates under the similar principle as the bicarbonate. Taking it results in the higher amount of a biological buffer called carnosine. And so our body also produces carnosine. It's a very powerful buffer. We don't have a lot of it, but it is another, like bicarbonate in our body, that will help us buffer acid. Taking beta-alanine will basically ultimately convert itself or get converted to carnosine. It's been shown to be effective for the same types of activities, these high-intensity types of events and activities and sports, The problem with beta-alanine is that red underlined statement right there. The dose, 3 to 6 grams a day. You find it in powder form in a lot of supplements out there. I know the Cytosport, the people who make Muscle Milk, has something called Monster Pump. I think that has a fair amount of beta-alanine in it. It's out there, right? And it's not hard to take. You mix it with water, and it's usually found mixed with other products, sometimes with creatine, sometimes with other stuff. Easy to take, but the problem with beta-alanine is it takes a really long time for the expression of carnitine and its concentrations in our muscles to get to a point where it's beneficial. So 4 weeks is where we really start to see the benefits. And to ask an athlete to be consistent taking something like this, for 4 week time until they just start to see benefits, it would have to become an everyday part of their sort of diet and supplement regimen. It's not impossible, and it's just very, I would say, inconvenient in that way. One of the interesting side effects of taking beta-alanine is this paresthesia, which is a tingling sensation, so the sort of the pin the needle sensation. Some people get it pretty quickly after taking it, within about half hour. It lasts anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds and can be, just in an arm, or it can be kind of a whole body thing. For those of you who've taken it, you know what I'm talking about. Other than that, though, there are no other side effects, and the paresthesia isn't too horrible. I've taken it before and experienced it myself, and it's not too bad. It kind of lets you know that the stuff is at least in your body. So I think this is the last one. So nitric oxide, and so this is, over the last decade for sure become quite popular. So nitric oxide, so NO products, right? You'll see NO, NO Explode is, one of the big products out there. These nitric oxide releasing agents, and so nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator. And so arginine is a product of one of the releasing agents that you'll see products with a lot of arginine in it. When we consume arginine, which is an amino acid, it will basically get converted to nitric oxide. And when it does, it causes a vasodilation, so the opening up of our blood vessels. And so it will increase, right? And the theory is it'll increase blood flow to our muscles, allowing our muscles to get more nutrients, more oxygen, enabling them to do more work. So this pump, right? And you take them, and for those of you that have taken any of these NO products, right, you'll feel a pump, right? You kind of feel like your muscles are just pumped up. And so it does do this. One of the, so some of the claims are, it increases muscle strength and size because of the increased nutrients getting there. It'll speed up recovery because we're able to take the toxins out of the muscle and deliver the nutrients that the muscle needs to recover there more effectively. Does it do that? Not really, right? And so those of you, again, following along in your physiology classes, the body does this naturally. You start to lift weights, let's say you start doing a bench press, blood flow to your chest is going to go up because of that. It goes where there's a demand. And so some of the claims of the NO agents are quite exaggerated. The research out there doesn't show it has a benefit to endurance exercise. There is some mixed results. With the strength exercise, some of the studies aren't super great. Some of them are, and it's really a sort of a mixed bag out there. One thing that these taking arginine has shown to do in these NO products is that it will increase the presence of insulin-like growth factor 1, so IGF-1. And IGF-1 is kind of like a testosterone in a way in the muscles. It stays localized in muscles, but when you take the NO, it's all throughout your whole body. But IGF-1 will signal basically the anabolism, right? It'll signal the building of muscles. And so taking these NO products in studies is showing an increased expression of this IGF-1, which could be leading to a little bit increase in muscle mass and performance. But really, to me, it's one of those supplements right now that I'm like, it's probably not worth taking. Side effects aren't too horrible. Diarrhea, nausea. I haven't dealt with anyone. I know a lot of people who take this. They haven't experienced those, nor have they experienced migraines. But if you're sensitive to those three things, I would definitely say it's not worth taking. And at this point, not worth taking just because of the lack of benefit. So it is also not regulated, nor were the buffers. I don't know if I mentioned that. The buffers aren't regulated either. So WADA and NCAA, they don't mess with the buffers. So so that's it for the Ergogenic Aid talk. It was a little bit lengthy. Hopefully you got some benefit from it. Please, please, please get outside the box for your assignment. And we'll talk soon.